On April 16th, 1945, the Red Army launched its final major offensive against Berlin. 9 days later, on April 25th, Soviet forces had completely encircled the German capital. That same day, American and Soviet troops met at Torgau on the Elbe, cutting through what remained of Nazi Germany from opposite directions. The empire that had once controlled vast territories across Europe was collapsing. And yet, beneath the ruins of Berlin, Adolf Hitler was still issuing orders. You can imagine the scene. An underground bunker, surrounded by a capital being destroyed above it, while the men who had helped build Hitler's regime were beginning to make decisions of their own. On April 23, 1945, Hermann Göring sent Hitler a telegram asking him to confirm whether Göring should assume leadership of Germany if Hitler was no longer capable of governing. Hitler did not interpret the message as a practical question of succession. He saw betrayal. Göring was stripped of his offices and ordered placed under house arrest. But Göring was not the only senior Nazi leader preparing for what might come after Hitler. During April 1945, Heinrich Himmler began searching for a way to negotiate a separate surrender to the Western Allies. Through Swedish diplomat Folke Bernadotte, he transmitted an offer concerning surrender on the Western Front to General Dwight Eisenhower. Then, Hitler discovered what Himmler had attempted. During the night of 28 to 29 April, Himmler was stripped of his positions and ordered arrested. The collapse was now happening inside Hitler's own leadership. On April 29th, Hitler dictated his political testament. Göring was excluded from succession, while Admiral Karl Dönitz was named head of state. The next day, April 30th, Hitler killed himself inside the bunker. But the destruction did not end there. During the final 5 months of the war, about 350,000 concentration camp prisoners died. The regime was collapsing, yet its machinery of death continued almost until the end. And that is where the Real story begins. Not with Hitler's final act, but with the moment the men closest to him realized that the empire they had served was no longer something they could save. By April 1945, Hitler's empire did not collapse in a single night. You can trace its destruction through a sequence of military disasters that had already stripped Germany of the power to control the war. On April 16th, the Red Army began its final major offensive against Berlin. Soviet forces advanced towards the capital while German defensive positions weakened under the pressure. On April 25th, Soviet troops completely surrounded Berlin. But the political structure inside the Reich was also beginning to fracture. The same day, April 25th, American and Soviet troops met at Torgau on the Elbe. The meeting had enormous symbolic importance. German territory was being cut apart, while Hitler remained underground in Berlin, increasingly isolated from events beyond the capital. The irony was impossible to miss. Hitler had built his authority around absolute control. Yet by the final weeks, his senior commanders were confronting a different reality. The decisions that mattered were increasingly being made by armies advancing from outside Germany rather than by orders coming from Berlin. And then, the question of succession became unavoidable. On April 23rd, Hermann Göring sent Hitler his telegram. He asked for confirmation that he should take leadership if Hitler could no longer govern. Göring had once stood among the most powerful men in Nazi Germany. Now his attempt to clarify the transfer of authority was interpreted as treachery. Hitler responded by removing him from his offices and ordering his confinement under house arrest. Only days later, Heinrich Himmler's own actions produced an even greater shock. During April, Himmler sought a separate surrender arrangement with the Western Allies through Folke Bernadotte, hoping to negotiate on the Western Front. But Hitler discovered the attempt during the night of 28 to 29 April. Himmler was stripped of his positions and ordered arrested. The two men who had occupied enormous positions within Hitler's system were now enemies in his eyes. And while Berlin was being surrounded, Hitler's inner circle was no longer preparing for victory. They were preparing for what would happen after him. On April 23rd, 1945, the decisive break between Adolf Hitler and Hermann Göring came through a telegram. By that date, Berlin was already facing the final Soviet offensive. The Red Army had begun its assault on April 16th, and by April 25th, the German capital would be completely surrounded. But inside Hitler's leadership, the crisis was no longer only military. It was personal. Göring sent Hitler a telegram asking him to confirm whether Göring should assume leadership of Germany if Hitler became unable to govern. On the surface, it was a question about succession. Hitler saw something completely different. He interpreted Göring's message as an attempt to seize power while he was still alive. And then, the reaction was immediate. Hitler stripped Göring of his offices and ordered him placed under house arrest. The man who had once occupied one of the highest positions in Nazi Germany had suddenly become a prisoner of the leader he had served. But there was another layer to the crisis. The German state was approaching a moment when succession could no longer be treated as a distant political problem. Soviet forces were closing around Berlin, while American and Soviet troops had already met at Torgau on April 25th. The war was reaching its final stage. Göring's removal therefore mattered for more than one man. It revealed that Hitler no longer trusted even one of the most powerful figures within his own regime. And the pattern would repeat. During April, Heinrich Himmler was secretly seeking a possible separate surrender to the Western Allies. Through Swedish diplomat Folke Bernadotte, he transmitted an offer concerning surrender on the Western Front to General Dwight Eisenhower. Then, during the night of 28 to 29 April, Hitler learned what Himmler had attempted. Himmler was stripped of his positions and ordered arrested. Within 6 days, two of the most powerful men associated with Hitler had been removed from his circle. The irony was bitter. Hitler had demanded absolute loyalty, yet as his empire collapsed, his closest leaders were increasingly thinking about succession, negotiation, and survival. And on April 29th, Hitler made his final decision about who would inherit what remained of his state. On April 23rd, 1945, Hermann Göring's position changed in a matter of hours. You have to understand what made the moment so extraordinary. Göring was not an outsider challenging Hitler from a distance. He was one of the most powerful men inside the Nazi state, and his name had been connected to the regime from its rise to its final days. Yet one telegram was enough to transform his status. Göring had asked Hitler to confirm whether he should assume leadership if Hitler became incapable of governing Germany. With Berlin approaching complete encirclement, the question was no longer theoretical, but Hitler treated it as an act of betrayal. Göring was stripped of his offices and ordered placed under house arrest. There was no dramatic escape, no triumphant departure from Berlin. Instead, one of the regime's most powerful figures was confined while the capital around him was collapsing. And the timing made the humiliation even sharper. On April 25th, only 2 days after Göring's telegram, Soviet forces completely surrounded Berlin. On that same day, American and Soviet troops met at Torgau on the Elbe. Outside the capital, the war was visibly moving towards its conclusion. Inside, Hitler was cutting away people who had once stood at the center of his political system. Then came another betrayal. Heinrich Himmler had already been searching for a way to negotiate a separate surrender with the Western Allies. During April 1945, he used Swedish diplomat Folke Bernadotte as an intermediary and transmitted an offer concerning surrender on the Western Front to General Dwight Eisenhower. But Hitler discovered the attempt during the night of 28 to 29 April. Himmler was stripped of all his positions and ordered arrested. Now both men had fallen from Hitler's confidence. And there was a bitter irony in what happened next. Hitler's empire had been built around obedience to one man. Yet in its final days, the question of who would control Germany after Hitler was becoming impossible to avoid. On April 29th, Hitler dictated his political testament. Göring was formally excluded from succession. Admiral Karl Dönitz was named head of state. The following day, Hitler would be dead. But Göring's humiliation was only the beginning. The final collapse would soon reach every remaining layer of Hitler's government. On April 29, 1945, while Soviet forces were closing around Berlin, Adolf Hitler dictated his political testament inside the bunker beneath the ruined capital. The document revealed how completely his political world had changed. Hermann Göring, once one of the most powerful figures in Nazi Germany, was excluded from succession. Heinrich Himmler had also fallen from Hitler's confidence after his attempt to negotiate with the Western Allies became known. And then, Hitler named Admiral Karl Dönitz as head of state. The decision came only one day before Hitler's death. By this point, the German state was no longer functioning as the enormous political machine it had once been. Berlin was surrounded. Soviet forces were pressing into the capital. American and Soviet troops had already met at Torgau on April 25th. Yet Hitler's final political document still attempted to determine who would inherit the remains of his government. There is a bitter irony here. Hitler had spent years demanding obedience from Germany's political and military leadership. But when his own empire was collapsing, the final transfer of authority was decided inside an underground bunker, surrounded by an advancing enemy. And the consequences were immediate. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler killed himself inside the bunker. His death did not instantly produce a peaceful transition. The new government under Dönitz existed during the final days of the war, while German forces were still fighting and surrender negotiations were underway. Meanwhile, the people closest to Hitler faced their own choices. Joseph Goebbels, whom Hitler had appointed Reich Chancellor in his political testament, remained committed to the collapsing regime. On May 1st, Goebbels and his wife, Magda, poisoned their 6 children before both of them died by suicide. The regime was disappearing through a series of individual decisions. Göring had been removed. Himmler had been dismissed. Hitler was dead. Goebbels was dead. And Dönitz had inherited a state that was already facing unconditional surrender. On May 7th, German armed forces signed an unconditional surrender in the West. A second document was signed in Berlin on May 8th, with the surrender taking effect at 23:01 Central European Time. The empire had finally reached its legal end, but some of the men who had helped build it still had to face what came after the collapse. And for Himmler, the final escape would last only until May 23rd. After Hitler's death on April 30th, 1945, the collapse of Nazi Germany became personal for the men who had once stood at the center of the regime. Heinrich Himmler was no longer Reichsführer. Hitler had stripped him of his positions after learning of his attempt to negotiate with the Western Allies. The man who had commanded one of the most powerful organizations in Nazi Germany now had to disappear. Himmler tried. He attempted to hide under the name Heinrich Hitzing, using documents and the uniform of the secret field police. But the disguise did not give him a new life. On May 20th, 1945, Soviet soldiers captured him and handed him over to the British. 3 days later, on May 23rd, Himmler was being searched when the final secret he carried became fatal. He crushed a concealed cyanide capsule between his teeth and died. The irony was brutal. The man who had spent years exercising enormous power over other people's lives ended his own life while attempting to avoid capture. But his fate was only one human story among hundreds of thousands. During the final 5 months of the war, about 350,000 concentration camp prisoners died. That represented roughly 30% of the approximately 1.2 million deaths in concentration camps during the entire period. These were not abstract numbers. Each number represented a person whose life ended inside a system that continued operating even as Germany itself was collapsing. And the scale becomes even more disturbing when Auschwitz-Birkenau is considered separately. Approximately 865,000 Jews were sent directly to its gas chambers. By the time Hitler died, the regime responsible for this destruction was already disintegrating. But the human consequences did not disappear when the bunker became silent. There is another bitter irony here. Hitler and his senior officials had created a system designed to dominate millions. Yet by May 1945, their own futures had narrowed to a handful of possibilities: capture, surrender, suicide, or disappearance. Göring was under arrest. Himmler was dead. Goebbels was dead. Dönitz had inherited the remnants of the state. And on May 8th, Germany's unconditional surrender became effective. But surrender did not erase responsibility. For the survivors, the collapse of the Reich was not simply the end of government. It was the beginning of a search for answers, evidence, and accountability that would continue long after the guns stopped firing. By May 1945, the men who had ruled Nazi Germany were discovering that power offered little protection once the state itself had disappeared. You can see it most clearly in Heinrich Himmler. During April 1945, Himmler had attempted to establish contact with the Western Allies through Swedish diplomat Folke Bernadotte. His objective was a separate surrender on the Western Front. But once Hitler discovered the attempt during the night of 28 to 29 April, Himmler was stripped of his positions and ordered arrested. The man who had once occupied one of the highest positions in Hitler's system was suddenly trying to escape the consequences of his own decisions. After Hitler's death on April 30th, Himmler did not return openly to the new German government. Instead, he attempted to disappear. He used the name Heinrich Himmler and carried documents connected with the secret field police. The disguise was supposed to conceal his identity from the authorities searching for senior Nazi officials. It failed. On May 20th, 1945, Soviet soldiers captured Himmler and handed him over to the British. 3 days later, on May 23rd, British authorities searched him. Hidden inside his mouth was a cyanide capsule. Himmler crushed it between his teeth. He died before he could face a trial. There is a bitter irony here. For years, Himmler had exercised enormous authority through the SS and had participated in a system responsible for mass persecution and murder. Yet when that system collapsed, his own strategy became concealment, false identity, and escape. Göring's fate was different. On April 23rd, his attempt to clarify the succession had been interpreted by Hitler as betrayal. Göring was stripped of his offices and placed under house arrest. He survived Hitler's suicide and the collapse of the regime, unlike Himmler and Goebbels. But the political world Göring had known was already gone. On May 7th, German armed forces signed an unconditional surrender in the West. A second surrender document was signed in Berlin on May 8th, taking effect at 23:01 Central European Time. The war was over. The hierarchy was shattered. The titles that had once carried extraordinary power could no longer protect their holders. And the final irony was that Hitler's greatest demand, absolute loyalty, had not survived the collapse of the state itself. The men who had served him now faced the consequences separately, one by one. By May 8th, 1945, the political world Adolf Hitler had built had ceased to exist. You can measure the collapse through dates. On April 16th, the Red Army began its final major offensive against Berlin. On April 25th, Soviet forces completely surrounded the capital. That same day, American and Soviet troops met at Torgau on the Elbe. On April 29th, Hitler named Admiral Karl Dönitz as head of state. On April 30th, Hitler died. And then, on May 7th, German armed forces signed an unconditional surrender in the West. A second surrender document followed in Berlin on May 8th, becoming effective at 23:01 Central European Time. In less than 1 month, the final German political structure had moved from military crisis to complete surrender. But the consequences were larger than the fate of one bunker. The meeting at Torgau on April 25th demonstrated that Germany was being overtaken from two directions. American forces were advancing from the west, while Soviet forces were driving towards Berlin from the east. The capital itself had become an isolated battlefield. The political consequences were equally dramatic. Hitler had once demanded that authority flow from him. Yet his final testament transferred the position of head of state to Dönitz only 1 day before Hitler's death. That decision exposed the weakness of the system at its foundation. There was no stable succession prepared for a peaceful transition. Instead, the final transfer of authority happened while the capital was surrounded and the military situation was collapsing. Göring had already been removed. Himmler had already been dismissed. Goebbels died on May 1st. Dönitz inherited what remained, and the human consequences were enormous. During the final 5 months of the war, about 350,000 concentration camp prisoners died. That figure represented roughly 30% of the approximately 1.2 million deaths in concentration camps during the entire period. The collapse of the regime, therefore, cannot be measured only by armies, borders, or surrender documents. It must also be measured by the lives destroyed while the state was fighting its final battles. There is a bitter irony here. The system that demanded obedience until the very end could not even preserve itself when its leader disappeared. Hitler had built his authority around personal loyalty. But after April 30th, 1945, there was no Hitler left to obey. And the men who remained were forced to confront something far more dangerous than losing political power: the consequences of everything that power had made possible. After May 8th, 1945, the men who had stood beside Hitler no longer controlled Germany. Their titles, offices, and authority had collapsed with the state they had served. But survival produced very different endings. Hermann Göring survived the fall of Berlin. Unlike Himmler, who died on May 23rd after crushing a hidden cyanide capsule, Göring remained alive after Germany's surrender. The man who had once been designated as Hitler's successor was now facing a completely different world. His transformation was extraordinary. On April 23rd, Hitler had treated Göring's succession request as betrayal and ordered him placed under house arrest. On April 29th, Hitler formally excluded him from succession in his political testament. Only days later, Hitler was dead. Göring was still alive. That contrast reveals something important about the final collapse. Survival was no longer determined by rank. Himmler had enormous authority but died on May 23rd. Göring had fallen from Hitler's favor but survived into the post-war period. The same pattern appeared elsewhere. Joseph Goebbels did not survive. On May 1st, he and his wife, Magda, poisoned their 6 children and then died by suicide. Admiral Karl Dönitz survived and inherited the position of head of state designated by Hitler on April 29th. But he inherited it only as Germany approached unconditional surrender. And then, the historical record becomes a warning against simplifying the aftermath into a single story. Some senior figures disappeared through death. Others were captured, Others survived to face investigation and judgment. For the wider population, however, the consequences lasted far beyond the surrender documents of May 1945. Approximately 350,000 concentration camp prisoners had died during the final 5 months of the war alone. The survivors had to live with the physical and psychological consequences of a system that had continued killing while its own leadership was collapsing. The later lives of Hitler's closest associates and their descendants require separate documentation. Fact required: verified information about specific descendants of Göring, Himmler, Goebbels, or Dönitz, including names, dates, occupations, and later lives. Without those records, it would be wrong to invent a family story simply to make the ending more dramatic. Because the real lesson is already visible. The Reich lasted only as long as its institutions, armies, and leaders could sustain it. When those foundations disappeared, the titles remained only as names. And for the survivors, the question was no longer how to rule an empire. It was how to live after it had vanished. Today, the final days of Hitler's regime remain preserved not because the empire survived, but because its collapse exposed what happens when political power becomes completely dependent on one person. The dates tell the story with brutal clarity. On April 23, 1945, Hermann Göring's attempt to clarify the succession was interpreted by Hitler as betrayal. On 28 to 29 April, Heinrich Himmler's secret negotiations with the Western Allies became known to Hitler, and Himmler was stripped of his positions. On April 29th, Karl Dönitz was named head of state. On April 30th, Hitler died. On May 8th, Germany's surrender became effective. 16 days separated the beginning of the final Soviet offensive from Hitler's death. 22 days separated that offensive from Germany's unconditional surrender becoming effective. That is how quickly a political system built around absolute authority could disappear. But the human story is harder to measure. Approximately 350,000 concentration camp prisoners died during the final 5 months of the war. Around 1.2 million people died in concentration camps during the entire period, excluding approximately 865,000 Jews sent directly to the gas chambers of Auschwitz-Birkenau. These numbers do not belong only to history books. They represent people whose lives ended while the leadership responsible for the system was already fighting over succession, negotiating escape routes, or preparing for its own survival. There is a bitter irony here. Hitler demanded loyalty as the foundation of his empire. Yet when the empire reached its final days, loyalty fractured among the very men closest to him. Göring was removed. Himmler attempted negotiations. Goebbels died with his family. Dönitz inherited a state that was already surrendering. And Hitler himself disappeared beneath Berlin on April 30th. The universal lesson is simple. When power becomes inseparable from one person, the destruction of that person can expose how fragile the entire system really was. If you want more documentaries that uncover the final days of fallen regimes through documented dates, decisions, and human consequences, subscribe to the channel. Each story helps a separate dramatic legend from what the historical record actually shows. And ask yourself one difficult question. When a leader demands absolute loyalty, at what point does obeying him become more dangerous than betraying him?